Welcome to NOWMORE Questions, the interview series on European affairs that gets conversation started. Based on the choices you made on the topics most interesting to you, we are launching this series with a first episode looking at the legal and political framework around the sustainable use of pesticides in the European Union. To discuss this, it is an honour and a privilege to be joined by Pekka Pesonen, Secretary General of Copa Cogeca, representing farmers and agri-cooperatives across Europe. Pekka has held this position since 2006 and was previously working for the Finnish Ministry of Agriculture. So, needless to say, Pekka knows a thing or two about agricultural policy in the European Union. Pekka, welcome to the show.
Pleased to be here.
It's really great to have you. And before we go any further, I'd like to ask you a little bit about Copa Cogeca for our audience who may not know that much about Copa Cogeca. Could you just explain in a couple of words what Copa Cogeca represents?
We represent European farmers and their agricultural cooperatives across the EU 27. We have approximately 70 member organizations that are national associations in each member state, and they come to us with their thinking, and together with our members we define our policy line that we would like to sell and promote to the EU, but also at different levels, at international level and also at national level where relevant. And for instance, when we deal with the EU institutions and especially with the council presidencies, such as the French presidency now.
And as you've been working in agricultural policy for so long, could you tell us maybe a personal anecdote or a story of what agriculture represents for you?
Well, agriculture is a good combination of biology and economy. And so we are extremely proud in our sector, in agriculture and in forestry also, that we represent, to put up biological processes to serve humankind, and how we produce food and how do we do that in an increasingly sustainable manner. I think this is the fundamental part of it, and the element that I'm particularly proud of is that we are very much founded on a farming family model. Of course, that is a dynamic model itself. Farming family or farming family unit is different what we had in 1950s. But nevertheless, it is very much about survival of that farming family model in Europe, and hopefully also internationally, that we would like to see.
Yeah, so that family element, it keeps families and rural areas alive. In terms of the topic that we're looking at today, the sustainable use of pesticides, there is an upcoming revision of the directive by the European Commission. Why does this matter to you?
It matters because it sets the framework for our action, a part of the value chain, how we produce our foodstuffs. We have certain phenomena in European agriculture that we cannot exclude. They are there for natural reasons, pest and disease. And to a certain extent, we have to control it. We cannot eradicate them completely, but we have to control it in order to produce consistent, high-quality, nutritious, affordable food. And this is why we have these, what I could call modern tools. And what I mean also modern is that it is in constant change. And this Sustainable Use Directive, which is now to be reviewed, is a good illustration that even if it was only implemented in 2009 and after 12-13 years, now we are going to look into a revision of it. We need to take another look how we organize ourselves here in Europe in relation of these technologies. But it is also important to note that what we do here in Europe carries a lot of significant factors and consequences to other parts of the world. And you may already know that we have, as we speak, European Union, African Union or African leaders meeting here in Brussels. And Africa is one of those continents where the action of European Union, especially when it comes to modern technologies or technologies applied and authorized, will have a significant impact. Only a few years ago, I talked to our colleagues in East Africa, And they put it very bluntly. They said that in Europe you have the luxury and you have the opportunity to choose whatever technologies you do. But in Africa, we have to feed our growing population. And importantly, we have to follow you in Europe in our technologies because we'd like to trade with the EU, and your standards are dictating what we can do in Africa. So as a matter of fact, as we speak, these very same issues are on the table, not only in agriculture, but also other parts of life. What is the role of the European Union, Europe in general in the world, and how we influence the world?
Europe is a global leader in setting standards, and at the same time, pesticides would usually be associated with a certain model of agricultural production. And there's been common agricultural policy in the European Union since around the 1960s, and the political support for growing food in Europe, sufficient food, affordable food. Have you seen that change over the past few years? I mean, would you say there is still a political support for productive agriculture in Europe?
Of course, there is political support for productive agriculture. It's easy to say that, easy to claim that I would like to see European agriculture or my specific region or my locality to move to something very specific in line with my own expectations. But at the end of the day, when we go to the supermarket, we buy our groceries. Most of us, overwhelming majority of us, will opt for the cheaper end of the scale. And so what is really important is that we are competitive, we produce food in an efficient manner, and importantly also in an efficient manner also taking into account the natural resources. So we can't be wasteful with our action. So for instance, when it comes to the land, we have to recognize the fact that it is better to use at least reasonably efficiently the land space, that area that we have under agricultural production, so that we do not occupy land unnecessarily. And that's the tricky part, because most of the land, globally speaking, actually is not suited for agricultural activity, or it is not suited for production of foodstuffs that could be directly consumed by humans. And so finding a balance between these different factors, and especially doing that in the European scale, in Europe with our conditions, is crucially important for us, and that is a real challenge for our policies, in particular some of the technologies like we discussed, Sustainable Use Directive and the update of it.
And wouldn't you say that now in the European Union the political mood is much more around making sectors more responsible for the way they are producing, and potentially also then leading to a consumption style, and that is much more directing the way that agricultural production will be going in the future, as opposed to its responsibility for actually growing food?
Well, this is the trend. We recognize it, and we listen to the civil society, we listen to the member states, we listen to the other parts of the world, how we do it and what we do it for. But how do we deal with these aspirations in the increasingly open trading environment? So it's easy to say that we go for the increased presence of, for instance, organic farming. But from our perspective, there has to be a combination of higher market share, higher use of agricultural land for agriculture, organic agriculture, but making economic sense to it also for farmers. So we are very much, for instance, supportive to the organic objectives, but we also underline the fact that the fact that we now have slightly higher margins for the organic production, we need to maintain that. So we do not want to sacrifice the good image and good idea in organic farming just to say that let's put it out there and compete that to the death. No, we need to recognize that we need to find a balance, and how to incorporate these ideas and objectives to the liberal market economy. That's the tricky question, but we take the challenge. We are working on it.
Yeah, understood. The other element is that obviously agriculture a primary sector working hand in hand with nature every day. So when we talk about climate change, I assume that agriculture actually probably knows a lot more about climate change than maybe some of the politicians talking about climate change in the safety of the political rooms. Have you witnessed specific events in the last few years? Do you have a monitoring system in place to understand the effects of climate change on agricultural production inside Copa Cogeca, for instance?
Well, of course, this is very closely linked with the market realities and market developments. And so we have seen certain phenomena over the past few years that we link. Of course, we need to be realistic in the sense that this needs to be based on science. So we are not a scientific body per se, but we assume that some of those developments are linked with more permanent or more trend-like changes in climate. We have seen some droughts, we have seen some flooding, late frosts in spring like last year. We recognize this. And then parallel to this, when we supported the Paris Agreement already in 2015, and we said that we are the main sector, agriculture and forestry, that actually can make a contribution. And we are interested. We would like to get into this. We already took initiative actually in Paris in 2015 to say that let's take a look into what we can do. And therefore, it is very much about enabling agriculture and forestry sector, the primary sectors, to make that valuable contribution. And when we look at the European action, European Union recent political initiatives, such as the Green Deal, Farm to Fork, we are happy to see some ambitious objectives there. But then what is missing is how to reach for those objectives in especially technology-wise. How do we make it work in the value chain to have more transparent, fair, and balanced value chain that would remunerate and help all actors in the value chain to make an effort? And how can we make put coherence in place for the EU policies, especially such in trade? And therefore, quite recently, when the French presidency took initiative to talk about, for instance, mirror clause, what that means that we would have to follow the same standards in our imports. We recognize the complexities of international trade once again, but the principle must be respected. We have to take a look into what we put in place in Europe to combat these elements and make sure that that action on climate change or biodiversity perhaps would be respected by coherent policies internationally. It's not an easy task, I have to admit. When we talk to our international colleagues, European Union is seen as a bit of a overly ambitious, overly enthusiastic continent in this respect, and we are sometimes struggling to convince our partners, to be very frank with you.
Yeah, that's often the case, that we have very radical measures in Europe, and then we tend to export our problems into other parts of the world and import them again. So that is a bit of a problem. Let's talk a little bit about pesticides, a little bit more in detail. We're talking about the sustainable use of pesticides, but there is the word use there. So I'd like to start with that. Let's just ask a very basic question. Why do farmers use pesticides?
We use pesticides because it provides at least a partial solution to a phenomena that is fundamentally present in the value chain in production of food. It's about pests and disease that we need to control. While we control it, we have, in Europe in particular, we have developed a kind of comprehensive approach to these measures, and we call it integrated pest management. And pesticides provide one part of a solution, and in many respects it's usually the last tool in the toolbox to be used if the other measures do not sufficiently provide the answer. So in particular, when we talk about physical means, biological means, and chemical means in terms of combating pest and disease. This is like, in concrete terms, we cultivate our fields, we plow the fields to minimize the impact of weeds, for instance. But then in some cases now, especially with the climate change, we have to minimize plowing because it usually releases atmospheric or greenhouse gases, and we're trying to avoid that too. Also, it's a major cost factor to us. Also, when it comes to biological means, usually the challenge with the biological means is that they are not very effective. And we have been in full support of the European Union when it comes to developing what we call low-risk means, low-risk measures, substances to combat pests and disease, at least partially to replace pesticides, what we called like chemical compounds and molecules, chemical molecules that we have to apply occasionally. So it's a kind of comprehensive view, and we're very committed to this. And the crucial element of this also is that it is very much in the interest of farmers to have this comprehensive approach, including training, education, what we do and why we do it, because it's also about protection of farmers' own health by applying these technologies. Because it is not the consumers that are present when pesticides occasionally have to be used. It is the farmers themselves. And as a part of the pesticide or the integrated pest management, we see also an opportunity to make sure that we are not being exposed too much to the risks of these substances that sometimes can be seen as a harmful element for our lives.
Yeah, understood. And would you agree that there is evidence that the excessive use of pesticides is in fact also a problem for farmers in terms of production, in terms of yields, because it may affect other types of, pollinators and other functional beings and microorganisms to agricultural production?
Well, by definition, the word excessive actually indicates that you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. Use of any substance, any action excessively means that you shouldn't do it. But then what we have to keep in mind is that if we don't have another tool available to control, then the question is that you either do it or you lose the whole crop, or you lose the performance of the whole exercise that you have in the first place. The tricky part is that when do we apply this? And this is where we have been working very, very hard with our stakeholder groups, other industries, also downstream industries. How can we develop methods and value chains that would actually reward us not to use that much synthetic molecules, pesticides, and replace them by something else. But it is very much linked with the market and also assessing the cost-benefit part of the usage. But then I'm afraid the big question that we have to pose is that these products, the whole range has to be in the toolbox, and we only apply them if the other tools are not sufficiently efficient in combating the phenomena that we have to minimize. So it's very much about order of preference, like pecking order of the tools that we use, and we would like to see, like I said, the use of low-risk substances, biological control measures, more developed, especially at European level, because we see some opportunities. For instance, orchards, fruit and vegetable sector, it is more present, more opportunities. But we also have to recognize that when we talk about, for instance, bread, wheat, cereals, these low-risk substances and biological control measures are much less effective, and they can be quite costly also in reaching for that objective that we need to aim for, meaning reducing the presence of pests and disease so that we can actually produce a marketable, good quality product. And so we don't use pesticides for the sake of pesticides. We use pesticides and other tools in the cultivation to reach for that objective that we feel that is important for the consumers at the end.
Yeah, farmers are not growing pesticides. I think that's very clear. And if I understand you well, it's in the toolbox. It's the chemical and synthetic pesticides are more like a last resort to some extent, and you always would try and find other alternatives.
You can say that, yes.
When the European Commission in its farm to fork strategy comes up with very big targets, of reducing essentially by half, as I understand it, the use of chemical pesticides. What does that actually mean for a farmer today? I mean, that sounds like a very ambitious target, but is it already something that's on its way anyway? Or do you feel that this is going to lead to some very drastic changes in the way agricultural production is being managed today in Europe?
Well, I wouldn't say that the 50% is a good figure, or it should be more or less, because it's more to do with what is once again the toolbox, how to reach for that reduction. And in most cases, we have to apply a set of measures to offset the use of some pesticides that are considered politically or scientifically dangerous, or that the society wants them to be eliminated. Quite recently, we have had the discussion on glyphosate, but then controlling weeds is a particularly complicated matter, in the sense that you cannot, if you cannot apply glyphosate, for instance, to eliminate weeds before you do the first round of cultivation or the sowing of the crop, you would have to apply some other means. And then it's for the farmer, it's like, what would be the alternative and what would be the consequences, especially when it comes to cost, and now increasingly also when it comes to environment. So if we can't apply these products that have proven to be effective in combating weeds, if we do that through other means, usually we have to employ several means and tools at the same time. So this is what we ask for the Commission, European Commission and European institutions to give us. So give us the toolbox to make it happen. And typically, we need to employ, once again, a multitude of elements. And for instance, if we wanted to increase the resilience of our crops against weeds and or pest and disease, the easiest way to do it and the most effective way to do it is to increase our genetic resilience, which is actually the long-term development where European Union has been very good at. We have been able to produce more food, and about 70% of that productivity increase actually comes out of better genetic material that we have been able to employ. And this is not only European phenomena, this is international development that our colleagues also, for instance, from other parts of the world, actually communicate in the same manner. They see this as an opportunity. The big thing now in this respect is that some of these technologies are controversial in the eyes of the society. And even the Commission is a bit reluctant to talk about them. Typically, what we call about new genomic techniques, new breeding techniques of our plants and livestock, where we could increase the resilience of the genetic, the genetic structure would increase the resilience of our plants and animals. And I think the key here is that we need to take a more comprehensive look into those developments. So if I simplify a bit, if we switch on or off some of the qualitative elements of the crops, how would that impact to the immediate environment? And so we need to, for instance, typically in animal side, we need to take a look into whether we could do something about animal welfare, that the animals will stay healthier, and at the same time they would genetically develop some qualifications or qualities that actually would enable them to live happier lives or better lives, better life quality in terms of the animal itself. So we need to address a wider set of elements when we develop our plants and animals for future. But the important factor here is that it would help us to answer some of those questions and challenges that we will face when we get rid of X% of pesticides and synthetic molecules, for instance. So we don't have much choice. So if we don't develop an alternative one way or another, it's basically you have to either you can produce it or then you don't produce it. And we don't like that option because it would limit our opportunities too much.
Yeah, and you talk about this toolbox in a in a very comprehensive manner, but it feels that on a regulatory political side, it's rather taking a magnifying glass and looking at every single part of that toolbox and analysing it, and not necessarily looking at the toolbox as a whole.
And this is what we've asked the Commission. So we've asked for the comprehensive impact assessment of the Green Deal, because the farmers do not just optimize one part of the chain. They have to react and adapt to a vast number of elements that would most probably move in a different pace once we touch something. So it's like pulling a piece of log from a pile and see what happens. So that's why we say that we need to take a look into the technologies themselves, typically like genetic material, biocontrol measures, low-risk substances, also data, digital agenda. Can we do something about it in terms of getting the information better to the more reliably to the consumers and back? How does the value chain work, and what are the coherence? What is the coherence of the other policies? So all these are very much present in the farmer's decision making. So if the society tells us that you have to go away from pesticide use, and we see the reduction of crops or the yield by, let's say, 30%, which is probably much more, but let's say it's 30%, we have to generate income out of the 70% that is equivalent to the previous income, and that means that most likely we have to address the balance in the value chain and how to valorize this in the eyes of the consumers, because the consumers are not going to pay that voluntarily. So we need to say that instead of that 100%, we now produce 70%. This is what you as society wanted. So therefore, this is going to be more expensive. And how can we ensure that we would get the remuneration preferably from the marketplace? Because the taxpayers' money is going down. And so that's once again the difficulty that we had to combine these with the increasingly open trading environment.
Yeah, we'll be closing up. A couple of last questions. I cannot leave this interview without a question on the threat of bans, because I think that yes, there are certain groups in society calling for very specific bans on very specific products or practices. You mentioned glyphosate. There is also practices such as, I think, seed coating or aerial spraying, things like that. In hindsight, given some of the activities that have happened in agriculture, given some of the products that have been used in agriculture, do you feel that some of these bans could be justified?
Well, it depends on their scientific baseline. So if there's scientific evidence, then it goes without saying that then we have an argument to ban it in Europe, and then we could argue that all imports must comply with the same rule when it comes to imported foodstuff to the European Union market. I should say that this would be a straightforward answer to your question. However, science usually is not very exact. You can't say that this is it. It's black and white. And our trading partners don't outward as such. They need evidence. They need some concrete information why we do it. And therefore, I could go as far as saying that if there's no scientific evidence of the risks that are excessive and we should go away from it, and European Union bans a product in the EU, especially in that kind of situation, then we would expect that the European Union would carry its responsibility and also ban the same product when it comes to imports. But it sounds easy, but then what about the maximum residue levels? If, for instance, in our coffee, global coffee production, if there are some products that have been used in some other conditions in coffee production and they are banned in Europe in our conditions, what are we going to do with the maximum residue levels, the minute substance levels that we have in for instance, in the case of coffee? Should we ban coffee imports for the same reason? Or that if we have a substantial disruption to the marketplace, how far can we go? And you mentioned two particular elements, the aerial spraying and seed coating. Seed coating is agronomically probably the most efficient way of using and applying pesticides or any kind of substance that could protect the crop, because we only use the minimum amount to the actual part of the seed, that we don't spread the whole foliage, we don't spread the whole field. And so we need to consider also the benefits of this technology. Secondly, if you refer to aerial spraying, you know that precision farming is something that we are very much interested in some parts of the world. For instance, Israel, They are world champions in this area, where they actually put the action just in where it is needed. And quite often they use drones. So if we do not enable aerial spraying, which is probably somewhat different now with the drone usage than what it was in the past, we would have a problem. And we see this as an opportunity, especially in orchards, vineyards, when we see automated systems that could actually reduce our cost of production too. So this is exactly what we need from the European Union, enabling policies to technologies that we see beneficial for us also from the environmental sustainability point of view. And this is, I'm afraid, where the Commission has fallen short in their Green Deal proposal.
Okay, well, I think that's some fascinating insights on the world of agriculture that you've shared with us, Pekka. Thank you so much. If you had one big wish as this piece of legislation is going to go through the European Parliament, the Council, back to the Commission, when we'll have a final decision on this revision of the Pesticides Directive, what would be your main expectation as Copa Cogeca?
We need to have a harmonized EU approach, where we would ensure that we wouldn't have distortion of competition within the EU and with our trading partners. We play our share, we play our role for sustainability, but we need to be able to build our investment and our future to a fair market and fair value chain that would respect those millions of family farming units that we have out there. So it is very much a farmer's face behind the usage of any technology, and also pesticide. Keep that in mind in applying new ideas to the legislative framework, and I think that will do the trick.
Pekka, thank you so much for having been with us.
Thank you so much.
That was Pekka Pesonen. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next episode.